Good morning. This is Dr. Oba T'Shaka bringing you again the Dr. Oba T'Shaka Show. How you all doing? You cool? Copacetic? That's a dated term for the younger folks. Um, as usual, we have a good show for you. And today's show is on the eve of the assassination of the great leader uh, Malcolm X, also known towards the end of his life as El Hajj Malik El Shabazz, assassinated February 21st, 1965. So this is a few days before his assassination. And this is going to be in honor of the sisters. Now, we're focusing this show on El Hajj Malik El Shabazz, better known as Malcolm X's mother, Louise Langdon Little, a person from Grenada who came to the United States and married Malcolm's father, Earl Little. And that's how the whole thing began with the family thing. We'll go into more than that with her. So this is information that hardly anyone has because generally Louise Langdon Little has been reduced to a footnote when it comes to history. And she stands in her own right. So we'll be getting into that in a minute. I hope you've enjoyed the previous shows on Black Power and the latter shows that we've had. We also try to present timely shows. And since this is close to Malcolm's assassination, I thought it was important to do this. And then after doing some homework, I thought the best focus would be on his mother. Before getting into what I want to share today on Louise Langdon Little, I want to deal with an important news item. We have Brother Ogawa on and Stephen McKenzie. Hotep to both of you. This is one news item, but I thought it was important because it pertains to some of the politics going on with the Republican Party. We need to watch how it plays out. This speaks to division within the Republican Party and may be one of the things that offers a little hope to the Democrats coming into the midterm elections when most of the predictions on the outcome of the election indicate that the Democrats are going to lose control of the House, could lose control of the Senate, but more likely to lose control of the House, which would pretty much tie Biden up to executive orders because he ain't going to get anything through the House and the Senate. So this news item has to do with Senator Mitch McConnell, Senate Minority Leader, who has had some interesting relationships. He pretty much did Trump's bidding during his presidency. And when Trump faced impeachment in the Senate, while he was impeached in the House, Mitch McConnell led the drive to save him. But when January the 6th went down, he initially criticized this as a violent uprising, and then received signals from the power elite that finances the Republican Party that they didn't like what went on in January the 6th, which reinforced his stand against us because he really didn't want to break his ties to Trump because Trump controls the Republican Party. But since then, he's issued back and forth and recently a conflicting statement that goes against a statement he made after he backed off of his opposition to the January the 6th uprising. He then backed off of that because he tried to get that through his caucus, and the majority in his caucus in the Senate wouldn't go along with it because of the fear of angering Trump and the base that he controls. So what's important now is early this week, Mitch McConnell criticized a statement coming from the Republican Party censoring Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger, who both serve on the House of Representatives panel that's investigating the January 6th insurrection, something that this minority leader in the House opposes. So part of the Republican Party statement that censored Cheney and Kinzinger, the original draft wanted to drum her out of the party. The ultimate statement that was issued by the Republican Party censored these two and then described the insurrection as a legitimate expression of political discourse. So that's an interesting discourse. That means we could have that kind of discourse, huh? I wouldn't try it. So McConnell said the obvious that he hasn't had any guts to say before and may only say it for a while. But what he said then was this was a violent insurrection. That's like 1 and 1 equals 2. No kidding. But why is he doing this? He's been reading the polls, and the polls show that over 40% of the Republicans would support a challenger to the 2024 Republican presidential primaries. Many had thought that Trump had that sewed up, so we'll see. And his vice president has also made slightly critical remarks to the effect that he didn't have the authority to overturn the election of Biden. No kidding. So what McConnell is doing is reading the tea leaves, and what the tea leaves are showing through opinion polls and through other kind of polling that's being done, it's showing that there's a slight crack in Trump's base. And that crack came up in the victory of Biden over Trump, and that a sector of the white suburbs shifted to Biden. That's a crack he sees. And this contributed to Biden's victory. The main one was the coalition that we led through Black Lives Matter and his mishandling of COVID-19. McConnell's also afraid that a number of Trump picks to run in both the House and the Senate, who are all picks that kiss his behind, may win the primaries but lose in the general election because they belong in the category of the loony bin. And so McConnell, along with Bush II and other pro-business conservative Republicans who favor deregulation, which is basically the Republican agenda, and too many Democrats as well, they have been encouraging other candidates to run for the Senate and to run for the House, candidates that oppose Trump's candidates. They're making not a bold bid, but they're making an interesting bid because Trump controls the Republican Party. So we'll see if they can pull this off. And a number of the candidates that they're encouraging to run, they're squeamish because they're afraid of um, gaining the opposition of Trump, which could be the end of their career. So it'll be interesting to see this, because what's clear is any kind of division that occurs within the Republican Party can work against them. But with their voter disenfranchisement, the Supreme Court indicating that they'll support it and putting on hold the Georgia disenfranchisement, that is putting on hold a ruling on a district court that I talked about last week that opposed the disenfranchisement and said blacks should have an additional congressional district. The Supreme Court, by putting this on hold, is letting the election go forward. And given the way in which conservatives and the right wing control the Supreme Court, it's very likely that they would support this voter disenfranchisement in general. So this is an important thing to keep your eye on. So the topic for today centers on Malcolm's mother and certain key siblings, his family members, as well as a focus on the father. But the central focus is on Malcolm's mother, and the show is entitled The Little Known Influence of Malcolm X's Mother, Louise Langdon Little, on Malcolm X and his siblings. This will be the major focus of this discussion today. And I chose this because she's a neglected figure in the story of Malcolm X. And she deserves treatment in her own right. Had she not been Malcolm's mother, she would stand as a towering figure, as Malcolm's mother, even more so, especially since she played a primary role in influencing him. Louise Langdon Little has been portrayed generally up to now as a tragic figure. And this portrayal comes largely from the Autobiography of Malcolm X. And Malcolm didn't intend to portray her as tragic, but as a young child, his memories of his mother were limited. And so the major things that he could talk about was when the Klan had threatened the family, but he couldn't really say what she did when the Klan threatened the family. So what, and then his mother being put in a mental institution. And in the autobiography, it's not altogether clear what was wrong with her. She only had a nervous breakdown. We'll go into that later. So what you see her associated with is tragedy. And she certainly did face tragedy. The family did. But she was not a tragic figure. She was a heroic figure. She was one, in the African American expression, bad sister. You hear me? And she was a heroic figure in many ways. And I think that her eldest son, Wilford, who had the best memory of her, was the one who was in the best position to describe her characteristics, and that is his description. He described her as a heroic figure. But before getting into Louise Langdon Little, I want to put a little background on generally this field of Malcolm X and Malcolm X scholarship. In my own life, Malcolm was my second master, which means that he shaped a lot of my positions. I wear a goatee because Malcolm did. I used to talk like Malcolm. I don't anymore. In fact, I was so influenced by Malcolm that when I put out a draft on my book that I'll discuss in a minute on Malcolm, uh, Dr. Jacob Carruthers, one of my masters, read it and he said, I can't tell where Malcolm ends and you begin. And neither could I at that point. So that was a good time for me not to publish the book. So I learned a lot from Malcolm. He was my second master because um, he was both a deep thinker and a master organizer. And I had these two strands that I was interested in. He also went through a transformational process, which at the time I started my apprenticeship system, I went through, but didn't know he went through. The sixfold stages to mental freedom. We went through the same process. I didn't know that until his autobiography came out. And Malcolm was a revolutionary. I became one. So um, I was drawn to him. He meant something to me as he did to my generation and subsequent generations. In fact, the favorite saying in my generation among activists and many others was, according to Brother Malcolm X. That would be kind of like Black Christians, according to Jesus. You know what I mean? He wasn't Jesus, but he sure got high status. And when I'm out of the country, I heard people in Tanzania and other parts of Africa also referring to him. So, in putting Malcolm into the context of scholarship, I just want to note that in terms of my own, he had an impression beyond just his ideas, which were important, but the totality of the person. And it had an effect on a lot of us, myself included. I have a lot of research files. I have two huge wooden filing cabinets up here, almost 6 feet, full of files on different subjects. The largest set of files I have is on Malcolm X. And in preparing for this show, I went through all the files because I wanted to decide what was I going to focus on. And it was after looking at all the files that I said, Louise Langdon Little, for sure, because this is a neglected subject. So my first book that I wrote at the end of the San Francisco Freedom Movement, starting in 1966, and the book that took me the longest time to write because it was my first, is this book, The Political Legacy of Malcolm X. When I went up for tenure at San Francisco State, and Dr. Asa Hilliard was on my tenure committee, the FBI was trying to knock me out, just as they tried to assassinate me 3 times and denied me a teaching credential that I could have beat them on. So under the counterintelligence program, part of the program was to see that no militants were able to go out there teaching the youth because they had a whole program of separating the youth from their elders. And so Asa Hilliard was the only Black dean at San Francisco State, dean of the College of Education. For those of you who don't know who he was a great African-American scholar. He came from a family of teachers. He was a good friend of mine. And so when I went up for tenure, I had this manuscript on Malcolm X. Now, you didn't need a book to get tenured at that point. But Asa read it, and then he said, me and my brother will pay to have this book published. That's how nice he was. And then, which I didn't accept, but I appreciated. And then he fought for my tenure because there was a back and forth battle. They did not want me tenured. I understood. I wouldn't have hired me. I mean, if I was a president of San Francisco State, I wouldn't have hired me because you're hiring me to undermine the system. And you're not just getting some poop boot something. I'm a radical, you know? And I told my students, some of you heard this before. Now, this is partially was exaggeration in this sense. I say if the system was dumb enough to hire me, which it didn't want to, I'm smart enough to radicalize your black behinds. And that would be my mantra, you know. The truth is they didn't want me and we beat them. And thanks to Asa Hilliard, he played a big role in my community. So my first book was The Political Legacy of Malcolm X. Asa Hilliard's review of this book said, quote, Oba T'Shaka has written a book which dwarfs all other writings on Malcolm X. Dwarfs means beats. Your popular public scholar, Michael Eric Dyson, who comes up with a book almost every year, who teaches at Georgetown in Washington, D.C., reviewed all the major books on Malcolm X for the New York Times Book Review. And this is a big deal. New York Times Book Review normally wouldn't touch me with a 10-foot pole. The only reason why I got reviewed was Michael Eric Dyson, which I appreciate. And in fact, I got a call from Dr. Nathan Hare that morning saying, you're in the New York Times. That New York Times is like the publication that sets the tone for the propaganda of this country. So I'm not looking to be in the New York Times, but it was interesting because Dyson, it was a very thick review section on all these major writings on Malcolm. And he rated my book #1 against all books on Malcolm X. So I'm saying I do know a few things about Malcolm, aside from trying to be him at one point, which I'm not trying to be anymore. Found my own voice. But at the first level of mastery, it's imitation. And my first master was Garvey. My second one was Malcolm. And interestingly enough, Garvey was primary influence on Malcolm and his family, the Nation of Islam, and many others. Now, there are a number of other outstanding books on Malcolm X, and they are masters in their own field. Last year, I interviewed Brother Dr. Babazak Kondo on the assassination of Malcolm X. That's one of the best shows that we've had on this show. Over 4,000 some odd viewers have watched it. Over 150 critiques, not one. Well, of all of them, one you could say was negative. What really wasn't. Someone said, why are we still dealing with this subject? I would say that was a non-statement. Why? You know what I mean? Would you ask white people why you're dealing with George Washington? You know what I mean? Huh? Why? You got to ask that question. But other than that, it was a very controversial discussion because it was on the assassination of Malcolm X, and the implication wasn't nice for the Nation of Islam, but it was pure fact. And in fact, it was so factual, we didn't even get to the minister Louis Farrakhan. We weren't thinking about it. It was not a hit thing. And it was a back and forth with me and him, but he carried the load because his book is by far the best book on the assassination of Malcolm X, by far. And he put his life on the line by writing it. So Babazak Kondo's book on the assassination, entitled Conspiracy: Unraveling the Assassination of Malcolm X, was a thorough work. And by the way, it was inspired by my book. He called me while he was writing it and told me mine had inspired his. And then I read the draft and made a few suggestions, minor stuff, but recognized that this was a masterwork because, as we pointed out last year, he went to FBI headquarters, went into the documents. He did his homework and then prepared for his funeral. He didn't tell us that on the interview, but I know that from another brother that he expected not to live because that could get you killed, what he wrote at that time. Fortunately, it didn't. So on the assassination, Dr. Babazak Kondo, his is the premier work. And he's doing a revised edition. I don't know what he has to do to revise in this, but I'm sure he's found one or two things. Um, one of the best books on Malcolm X's family is this book, The Seventh Child. The Seventh Child. This is a family memoir. It's a memoir of Rodnell Collins, who was Malcolm's sister Ella's son, and Rodnell Collins himself, his memories of Malcolm, with the assistance of a brother named Peter Bailey, who's a good brother, radical black man. And what's good about this book is this is the family's view of Malcolm. And, you know, the family is generally not going to put you on a pedestal. They are going to treat you the way you deserve to be treated. And so, you know, you get some stories in here that Malcolm wouldn't put in the autobiography, like his attempt to pickpocket when he was on the street some white woman who just happened to be a wrestler, and she bounced him off one wall after the other. You ain't putting that in the autobiography. That's kind of kill your street creds. You know what I mean? There's a lot of other stuff in there that I'm not going into in this show, because this show is going to focus on the mother. But this book is showing the impact of the family on Malcolm and on the Nation of Islam. And they played a very important role in building the Nation of Islam that's also been ignored. So again, this is an important work. You should read it. Excellent work. You know? So, you know, anything that's going to give you a firsthand view of how the family viewed Malcolm is going to be valuable, and particularly given where it came from. The book that I'll draw from today, along with my own writing and others, is a monumental work called The Dead Are Arising, The Life of Malcolm X. The Dead Are Arising, The Life of Malcolm X. This is an extremely important book. This is a biography, and it's written by the Pulitzer Prize-winning news reporter Les Payne and his daughter, Tamara Payne. He died before the book was finished, so Tamara finished the book. Now, I agree with my good friend Raymond Winbush, who appeared on this show in the very beginning when we were dealing with the reparations issue, and Ados. He's an expert on reparations. He wrote one of the blurbs for the book, and I see it was excerpted blurb, so it was much longer than this. And he said basically what I agree with. He said, The Dead Are Arising will become the definitive biography of Malcolm X. Now, of course, the one that we know by Alex Haley was an autobiography dictated to Alex Haley by Malcolm, and it has its value. But the biography is something, in this case, written by two people not related to Malcolm, and it is the thoroughness of the data in this book that makes this outstanding, and it leads to the need to correct a lot that's in the autobiography. Now, there's other faults with the autobiography that when I do an update on my book, The Political Legacy of Malcolm X, which is not a biography that I'll bring out for other reasons. But The Dead Are Arising is a magnificent work. It doesn't attempt to provide political clarity to Malcolm's political thoughts. It's focusing on a biography, as did the autobiography. And you can write a biography that deals with the in-depth political views of a person if they're political. But in the case of Les Payne, and his daughter, Tamara Payne, they chose not to, and it's fine because what they've uncovered is, eye-opening, very, very important. So why emphasize Malcolm's mother's central role in his development? Why? There are a lot of reasons. I'll focus on two. One is to correct the false narrative put out by the Nation of Islam that says that Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam basically made Malcolm. Now there's some truth that they had an influence on Malcolm, and it was important and contributed to his awakening, particularly his religious awakening. Malcolm's awakening transcended the path that the messenger sent his members on, which was literally religious. Malcolm's was political, social, economic, historical, cultural, philosophical. About the only thing he didn't cover was literature. That was his weakness. But other than that, his path was much broader, and his first transformation came under the great revolutionary artist, Paul Robeson. He was his first master. I pointed this out before. So I'm not denying that the nation had an influence, but nobody makes anybody, not even your mother. We're not claiming that Louise Langdon Little made Malcolm. She made the greatest contribution to his growth and development. And Wilford, his oldest brother, was a close third after the mother and the father, and the mother playing the greatest role. So human beings have strengths and weaknesses, and in the end, while we get a foundation somewhere, people help us develop. Finally, what we do in life has a lot to do with what we do with our talents, our gifts, our strengths, and our weaknesses. So the main reason I'm placing a central emphasis on Louise Langdon Little is because she was the central influence in Malcolm's life. And what we're seeing here now are some pictures of Malcolm, and we're seeing his family home that just came up. And we're going to see some other pictures of Malcolm and others who are associated with him. And so here you can see this was one of the family's homes in Michigan, what's left of it. And generally, Malcolm's father built the homes that they lived in. He was a master builder. And so this gives you a picture of the remains of the home. It should be preserved. This is author of a book on Malcolm X, the reinvention of Malcolm X. This is Manning Marble, and his book distorted a great deal in Malcolm's legacy. I appeared on a panel with him once, and I'll make some comments about his contributions later. This is my book, The Political Legacy of Malcolm X. It's also beautifully illustrated by a great artist, and the introduction is provided by a brother named Dengani, who was my chair of education in C.O.R.E and one of the leaders in the Black Arts Movement. He gave a brilliant introduction here. We'll see some other pictures. This is a picture of Malcolm with Adam Clayton Powell, and Malcolm was close to Adam Clayton Powell. He was one of the Black elected officials that Malcolm had respect for, in fact, the highest respect for. And as I pointed out before, something that no one knows, not even Kwame Ture. These two planned the first Black Power conference, and I'm sure the idea came from Malcolm. And when Malcolm was pushing the nation to take a political stand, uh, Adam Clayton Powell was a model for what the nation could do, put into office candidates who would represent the interests of Black people. And Adam Clayton Powell was the best congressman in Congress for Black and poor people in the history of the Congress. He got more legislation passed for Black and poor people than anybody else. So, and it was Malcolm who helped shape Muhammad Ali, and this is Muhammad Ali as Cassius Clay. And interestingly enough, Malcolm spoke a number of times in the Bay Area. One time was at McClymonds High School at a conference called The Mind of the Ghetto. It was sponsored by the Afro-American Association. And with him was then Cassius Clay, because this was before the heavyweight championship. And Malcolm played the major influence on Cassius Clay, later Muhammad Ali, and he later regretted his stance on Malcolm when he bent to the pressure of the Nation of Islam to disassociate himself from Malcolm. He later said he regretted that. This is a picture of Betty Shabazz, Malcolm, and 3 of his daughters, along with then Cassius Clay, soon to become Muhammad Ali. Again, this is after his defeat of Sonny Liston. And this is when he's moving around Harlem with Malcolm. And I think it's probably before he received his name, Muhammad Ali, because at that point, he's prohibited from having contact with Malcolm. This is an accidental meeting between Malcolm and King outside the Congress, and behind him is Ralph Abernathy. Usually don't see Abernathy in the picture. And this is grin and skin, because Malcolm had been saying quite a few things that weren't exactly kind about King, most of which he didn't believe. You know, he was running the party line because he had a lot of respect for King. And King said a few things that I'm sure he didn't like, but Malcolm really was on the offensive. But here they are, they meet, and by the end of each of their lives, they're moving in the same direction. And both murdered, assassinated at the same age, 39 years of age. This is Malcolm's mother, Louise Langdon Little. And this is a woman who was a force of nature. One beautiful, brilliant, radical sister from Grenada. When Castro, this is Fidel Castro on the left, when he comes to the United States, he's not allowed to send his delegation into a white hotel. And so Malcolm arranges for him to come to the Teresa Hotel. And this is one of the candid moments between the two. You can see they are enjoying each other. Now, this is Malcolm in the Nation of Islam. Elijah didn't like this meeting because he could put some heat on him. The FBI could do some stuff, you know what I mean? But that's Malcolm, radical. Castro, good man. This is showing them in conversation. The Cuban Revolution was a significant revolution, and it defeated the American effort to overthrow it in the Bay of Pigs. I was in Cuba twice and saw Castro. I was representing the National Black United Front with Reverend Herbert Dowtry. We negotiated with the Department of the Americas and reached agreements on many things, including a number of free positions for Black students in the U.S. to get an education in Cuba's medical school free of charge, along with a whole bunch of other things. And the whole time I was in Cuba, I couldn't sleep because I'm in a free space. It was kind of nice. You hear me? Castro was bad, and Malcolm liked him. This is a picture of Malcolm X in front of a demonstration site in New York. This is, you'll see the hat of the sister on the side, Congress of Racial Equality. The key point to make, I led the Black nationalist wing within the Congress of Racial Equality. The group inside the Black freedom movement or the civil rights movement that had the greatest impact on Malcolm was C.O.R.E. Why? Because we were based where he was based. And so when he saw the movement, he basically saw us. And we influenced him towards, well, by 62, 63, in a film, Make It Plain, one of his older brothers said, Malcolm stopped sounding like us in the Nation of Islam and started sounding like the civil rights movement or the Black freedom movement, meaning he was pushing the nation in that direction to engage in the movement, but the movement had an impact on him, just as he had a big impact on the movement. Again, his home, wherever they went, his father would build a home. He was a master builder, and we'll see why he was a master builder. So those are some shots of Malcolm X, later known as El Hajj Malik El Shabazz, one bad brother. In looking at Malcolm's mother's influence on him, there are a number of reasons why her influence, as well as the family's influence, and this show is going to focus on hers, is so central. My book, The Political Legacy of Malcolm X, is the first book to look at Malcolm through his own eyes, other than the autobiography, which was Malcolm's dictating to Alex Haley, but there are a lot of things that he dictated that didn't show up in the autobiography, so you don't get the full picture of Malcolm. In fact, Asa Hilliard said you could read the whole autobiography and not get a sense of Malcolm's political orientation, and that's true. And there's a lot of reasons for it. We now know there were missing chapters. There's a lot more to that only I know. And when I rewrite Political Legacy, you'll hear about it. You ain't hearing about it here. You hear me? So the mother is the central influence on Malcolm. But the key point of my book, The Political Legacy of Malcolm X, was that if you're going to understand Malcolm, you got to see him through his eyes. And most writers will just simply focus on their orientation. And it's understandable. And in fact, I'd say that you're not able to really understand Malcolm any further than your consciousness allows you to understand him. But what's been missed is Malcolm's view of the world. And I'm going to put it this way. In my family, because this relates to Malcolm, my brother had one view of the world and I had another, both raised by the same parents. Mine was more the world. My brother's was family. My brother saw everything through the lens of family. When I grew up, if I wanted to get a memory on something, I just asked my brother, what happened with this? And he'd run it down. And then my mother would say, yeah, everything negative. But it wasn't always everything negative. But I think sometimes she might have got the brunt of some criticism or something. I had a good mother, but that's the way that worked. But the key point is he saw the world through the lens of family. He was a family man. If he bought a present, it was what you wanted. It wasn't what he wanted you to have. It's what you wanted. That's a special lens. So the key thing to get straight is while families have an influence on all of us, some of us are centered in family. I'm centered in the world. My mother said, I raise my children and they become the children of the world. But my brother was always centered on family. He lived 5 minutes away from my mother. When he got a house, it was close to my mother's. He was a mama's boy, but mainly because family was central to him. Family, you know what I mean? And so my book was the first book to center Malcolm through his own eyes, the way he saw things through the lens of family. Malcolm was political, but his political transformations and changes all came through family influences at every point, you know? The breakup of the family would send him into the streets. Why was Malcolm more negatively impacted? His other family members said this, by the breakup of the family than any of them. You could say, well, he was young, but they were younger members of the family than him. They were all hurt, but not the way Malcolm was. He needed that family structure in a way that none of them did. They all needed it. But for Malcolm, when he loses that, he loses moorings. He loses support because family is his foundation. It's how he views the world. When he wakes up in prison, who engineers the wake up? His oldest brother, Wilfred, who engineers the awakening. When one thing doesn't work, he sends somebody else in. He's the leader of the family. And it's Reginald, who's got this little street mind that he learned from Malcolm that's able to manipulate that mind. But again, what wakes him up? Family. You hear me? When he embraces the Nation of Islam, what's Elijah Muhammad's role? Father figure. Now you can say, well, yeah, a lot of us have father figures, especially if we don't have a father. But I have spiritual daughters all over the country, and I'm like a father figure for them. And most of them have strong fathers. But I just fit the thing for another one. You know what I mean? And they for me. You know what I mean? But the point is, Malcolm, everything that happens in his life that represents a turning point or there's a central influence is through the lens of family. The autobiography leaves you with the impression that Malcolm's education in prison came through the prison library, his total education, except for one thing. That was a white library. There wasn't a black book in it. And so he read those books. That was good. He learned about world history, world politics, world philosophy, religions, all of this stuff. But where did the black books come from? Family. They brought them in from black bookstores. A to Z, J.A. Rogers, Carter G. Woodson, Miseducation of the Negro. I mean, he read the list. And who would even know to bring the right books in? A conscious family. You hear me? So I'm drumming a point home that I hope you really get. If you're to see Malcolm, to really see him, you need to see him through his eyes. And that is the key thing about Malcolm. El Hajj Malik El Shabazz. And this would affect him throughout his life. And so if family was central throughout his life, at every turning point, how central is your mother going to be? Well, when she's Louise Langdon Little, she's going to be as central as it gets. You hear me? Now, remember also, Malcolm's fairly young when he's undergoing all of these devastating influences. So some of this stuff that Louise Langdon Little implants in him is subliminal. Some of this stuff is coming up later. It's deep in his behavior pattern. Some of it is teachings that he may have moved away from but comes back to. But the foundation is already set up by mama. But this isn't just any mama. This is one extraordinary woman. So get it. Family central. So when I talk about the seventh child, that book's important because it gives you a view of family. Mine is framed around that. And the dead are arising. These are interviews with a lot of Malcolm's family members as well as friends. And Les Payne, who wrote this book, which now replaces the autobiography of Malcolm X, and it's hard to say, but it's the truth. Normally, I'd question the ability of a newspaper reporter to put together a good book of any kind, because of their training in terms of how they gather information for reporting. But I have to say, one reason why this brother's stuff is so good is that he used some common sense. Who were the best sources to go to in Malcolm's family? He did that. And he wrote it at a time in which most of the people close to Malcolm were still alive. He couldn't interview Louise Langdon Little. She was in mental institution for whatever reason. He didn't. I know that she was in good shape psychologically. In fact, she may have been dead by the time he did this book, because he was doing interviews in the 90s with a number of these people. So that may have been the reason he didn't interview her. So when we look at the impact of family, while the focus is on Louise Langdon Little, you have to look at how the bloodlines came together. The father's bloodline, Earl Little, who comes from Georgia, and the mother's, Louise Langdon Little. The emphasis is on her, but you got to understand these two, because Malcolm's a composite of the two. And to understand Malcolm's bloodline, again, the seventh child is instructive. And it's interesting that Manning Marble in his book completely neglects this. In his book on the reinvention of Malcolm, which is a fabricated title, Malcolm didn't reinvent himself, he transformed himself. He's making it sound like he was some fake, make-believe, made-up person, but he neglects in his book to deal with Malcolm's first known ancestor to come from Africa to America. In 1985, 20 years after Malcolm's assassination in 1965, 100 members of the Little clan met for a family reunion. This family reunion was brought together by a family member called Asa Little, and he held a number of family reunions after that. This family reunion was inspired by Alex Haley's series Roots. And Alex Haley is the author of the Autobiography of Malcolm X. So Haley's exposure to this kind of thinking came through his exposure to Malcolm and his thinking. And so Malcolm is in this meeting on another plane as an inspirational force. So the main purpose for this family reunion was to share with the family Asa Little's discovery of their first ancestor from Africa, kidnapped in Africa and brought to South Carolina in 1815. And his name was Ajar. Now, I was going over this morning and just thinking this through, and I came up with something that I hadn't thought of before. The qualities that I'm going to describe of Ajar, which are central qualities to the Little bloodline, central, are qualities most likely possessed by a warrior. Asa Little concluded, and Malcolm's sister, Ella, supported that Ajar was probably a Bambara, B-A-M-B-A-R-A, a person who comes from the Mali Empire. And the Malian people who are Bambara live in an area called the Bangaderia Cliffs, the same area in which the Dogon live. And Malcolm's sister speculated that he was probably Muslim, may well have been, but don't confuse it, because the Bambara Muslim was a traditionalist, they practiced African culture. And they were taught, if they were Islamic, they were taught it through the Dogon system of a Dunoso, which means table of signs. I've talked about this when I've gone through the African philosophy section on spirituality, the God within stuff. Because the Mambara were oral people, they traced whatever their lessons were, whatever they learned in the sand. And that's called a Dunoso, table of signs. And they trained masters. And what's clear about Ajar is AJAR is he was a master builder, but by his physicality and his spirit, a warrior, because the Bambara were warrior cultivators, warrior builders, whatever they were warriors because they were facing the slave trade at that point. And so if you were a farmer, you went to the field with your weapons. If you were a builder, the same thing. And a Bambara man could not leave his village for 21 years after he reached 21 because he was undergoing initiation to mastery. And then he had to stay in the village for 21 years to protect it. So I'm saying that it is very likely that Ajar was a prisoner of war. This is different from just any African captured. A prisoner of war has a different mentality. It's a fighting spirit. And they see themselves in that position. So what we know about Ajar, in addition to the research of Oscar Little, comes from a relative, Tempe Little. She was one of 22 children born to Ajar's son. So she was a granddaughter of Ajar, Tony, the son of Ajar, who was also a builder, who learned his building skills from his father. So what was key about Ajar was this. He was a rebellious African, someone who was never submissive to whites, someone who was not going to scrape and bow. He was powerfully built, black in complexion, midnight black, as was Malcolm's father and his uncles and his sister Ella. He was 6'4" in height. He was somebody you didn't mess with. He disappeared in the history of the Little family because he was probably sold. Probably sold. It's unlikely they killed him because he had skills that they valued. He wasn't a carpenter, he was a master builder, as was Malcolm's father. He wasn't a carpenter. He put every part of a building together, every part, a master builder. And that also meant he had undergone some initiatory training to get those mastery skills. So Malcolm's father and Malcolm's uncles and his grandparents before them, they inherited these same qualities. They were all fearless. They were all radical. Many of them got killed in the South because of it. And when Malcolm's father, Earl Little, married and had family problems, his father advised him, who was himself 6'4", a man that took no mess but could maneuver in the South better than him. He advised his father to leave the South. He said he was too uppity, meaning he wasn't going to scrape and bow to white people, take their head off if he had to, and was going to die for it. So he told him to leave the South, which he did. So when we see these bloodlines meeting, Earl Little and Louise Langdon, who becomes Louise Langdon Little, they meet in a Garvey convention in Canada. And Wilbur Wilford describes her as a small-boned, 5'8" erect woman who walked with a spring in her step until her 80s. In other words, her carriage was a carriage of pride, erectness. 5'8" for a woman there was a pretty good size, but compared to 6'4", small. And you saw a picture of her in the slides there. That's her with the natural. So this was a woman who was of Grenadian descent, who comes to Canada later in life as a grown woman and meets Malcolm's father. Now, there's a brother named Jan Carew, Jancarew. He's author of a book called Ghost in Our Blood, Ghost in Our Blood. He and I took part in a panel discussion in the 80s. And he was a big, tall brother himself, light complexion. He had a PhD. He came from the Caribbean, and he taught the Mexican government, how to use the system of supplying food provided in Mesoamerican civilizations, how to use a Indian diet to be healthy. And I remember what he said. I won't go into it. It was very revealing on the Seminole Wars. I had a friend here who was from the Caribbean, Paulu, who was staying here about 15 years ago. And he told me that Jan was not in good health, and he was going to see him, and he could get a book signed, autographed from him. So I have an autographed book in a very shaky handwriting because he was then facing some kind of nervous disorder. He's passed since then. But what he did is, Jan Carew, who had met Malcolm when Malcolm was debating a member of the House of Lords in London, and he actually beat him in the debate. But of course, the British gave the victory to the member of the House of Lords. Anyone that watched that debate can see that he didn't just win on points. He was even throwing Shakespeare at him. You know what I mean? Because Malcolm wouldn't tell you, but he actually likes Shakespeare. You know, he liked the flow of his language and stuff like that. So Jan Carew goes to Grenada to interview anyone that knew Louise Langdon Little, to get the story on her. So his writing is really the first that begins to explore who this woman was. Now, in the autobiography of Malcolm X, Malcolm says, and Malcolm's mother also said, that her mother had been raped by a white man, and that Louise Langdon Little was the product of that rape. Now, what happens when Jan Carew gets to Grenada, he finds a woman, an older Black woman. Her name was Tanta Bess, Tantabess. She knew Malcolm's mother. They were classmates. And she knew Malcolm's mother's grandmother, who raised her. And she told a different story. And the story was that Louise Langdon's mother had been warned by her grandmother, her name was Gertrude Langdon, to stay away from a white man named Norton. And she described him as a good-for-nothing, hit-and-run white man, meaning he'll sleep with you and run. You hear me? The mother didn't listen. She was a pretty Black woman who was probably entranced by this and whatnot. And so this is how Louise Langdon Little is born and raised by a grandmother under what in the Caribbean is called heavy manners. You know, spare the rod and spoil the child. The Africans in the Western Hemisphere all had this same philosophy. Look wrong, say wrong. What? She was raised like that. And she had that same strict thing that she carried to the US, which blacks have also, which is kind of a shame in that that's the thing we dislike most about slavery was the whippings. Now, ours usually wasn't as bad as the slave master, but sometimes it was just as bad. But it wasn't good. You hear me? But the key point is, and I was just thinking about this morning. Louise Langdon Little had to know what really happened with her mother. She had to know it because she was raised by her grandmother, and her grandmother's going to tell her, you know. And then Tanta Bess, who was a good friend, also knew. It was common knowledge. So I'd have to say that she came up with this story, maybe because it just bothered her that her mother would be fooled like that. So, Malcolm believed that this white blood that flowed in his veins came from a rapist. Well, it wasn't quite like that. So maybe her pride led her not to say what actually happened, but she had to know what actually happened. Now, Louise Langdon Little had qualities that Malcolm inherited. You want to know Malcolm when it comes to some essential qualities, that's his mama. Now, he also has some of the father's characteristics. Clearly, the rebelliousness is the father's as well as the mother's. First of all, she had a lot of energy as a child, and the same thing was said about Malcolm. She liked to play pranks on her way home from school. Malcolm was a prankster of his own kind. Him and Filbert did a lot of running around. In fact, that was his mess around brother. I won't go into all the stuff they did, but that there was a similarity there. She went to school neat and came home with her clothes all messed up, which means that she playboy. They're tough. Running, jumping up on trees and doing all kinds of stuff that kids do. Here's a key characteristic. She was the best student in her class. And Malcolm would become at least one of the best, if not the best student. So smarts, he inherited that. Now, his father had a third grade education. That doesn't mean he wasn't smart. That's what happened when you are working in Georgia and, under conditions in which education wasn't readily available. Didn't mean he wasn't smart. The man was smart. Smart ain't got too much to do with how many books you hit. But the fact is, Louise Langdon Little, she was academically smart and smart in many other ways, but she lacked discipline. And in the Caribbean, and I'm married to a lady from the Caribbean, it is common that parents will get you a tutor, even when you're sharp. My wife has done that with her son, and he is, when he wants to be a straight A student, could have gone to Oxford. He said he didn't want to become a white boy. His grandfather went to Oxford and got the first degree in architecture in Barbados. You hear me? On a scholarship provided by the Barbadian government. So providing a tutor is kind of the backup plan that Caribbean Africans have for their children. And she got one heck of a education, math, science, reading. Her favorite thing was poetry. And Malcolm had this ability to rhyme just instinctively. He was not a trained poet or anything else. He just had that poetic thing going on. So these were some of the qualities of Louise Langdon Little, later Little, that Malcolm would inherit. Just some of them. We'll go into others later. So she leaves Grenada during World War I her uncle invites her to come to Canada. And so this is where she meets Malcolm's father, Earl Little, who at this point is a member of the UNIA, Universal Negro Improvement Association. And this is a group that Louise Langdon is attracted to because she has a sense of independence. She wants to see her people free. And so they come together. And what is it that draws the two of them together? Type A personalities, first of all. In the church, they call this equally yoked. You know what I mean? Those aren't easy marriages sometimes. But when two people are secure, it's like two power centers. And if they respect each other, those two power centers can work quite well. So what comes together with the two of them, in addition to the strength, is a rebellious spirit. What attracts both of them to each other is both of them are proud of being Black. Now, Louise Langdon was lighter complexion than that picture indicates. She was proud of being Black. But there's another thing they shared, and this is something that sometimes we don't get when we look at the UNIA, because we see the Universal Negro Improvement Association as a Back to Africa organization, which there was some call for that, but Garvey generally didn't call for all Blacks to go back to Africa. He called for some. And he especially called for political independence. He wanted to see Africa for the Africans. And they identified with that. But a central tenet of Garveyism that Earl Little, Malcolm's father-to-be, identified with, and Louise Langdon identified with, was the emphasis on equality. And this is often ignored when people study the Garvey movement. They actually set up a series of positions hammered out in their national conventions in New York, where they developed a position on human rights, or the rights of Africans throughout the world. And it demanded that Blacks, wherever they were in the world, were treated with respect, and that freedom and equality were central. And this was central to Earl Little. Earl Little's son, Wilford, made this comment about his father. And you're going to misread this at first, because you're going to think, oh, this is a statement about integration. Oh, he wanted to be around white people. No, this is a statement about his belief that he had the right to do whatever he wanted to do. And so this is a comment he made about his father. He said, my father was famous for moving into white areas where they were the only Black ones in the neighborhood. Now, he didn't do this because he wanted to integrate. He was in the UNIA, you know what I mean? It was all Black organization. He was about the freedom of Black people, but he felt that he had the right to buy property anywhere he wanted to, or land, and build a property or house on. And so in doing that, he exposed his family to greater danger, because this is the 20s and then the 30s, and the Klan is rioting, and he's moving into areas after he leaves Philadelphia, because he and his wife joined the Philadelphia branch of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, which was the second strongest branch of the Garvey movement in the United States. The New York branch under Garvey was the strongest. And that branch was headed by a man named Eason. And John Henry Clark said of him, he was a better speaker than Garvey, more imposing in presence, tall, and everything else. And so that family, the Little family, make the decision to leave Philadelphia, where you have a nice Black community of fairly good size, and go into these predominantly white communities that are Klan infested. It took some guts, you know what I mean? But that was this attitude that Earl Little had, about equality, that blacks should be free wherever they are to buy a house wherever they wanted to or do whatever else they wanted to. So that was Earl's. At the same time, what was Louise Langdon Little's attitude about this? Got to remember, she's an immigrant coming from Grenada. So she's got a mentality that is coming out of the Caribbean world. And she's, grew out of Caribbean culture, African based. Remember, I pointed out in the Caribbean, African culture was dropped in the Caribbean. Here we had to rework it. And so it's fundamentally African, it's hybrid. It's got the African, and then alongside it and mixed into it, it's got the European. But the African predominates. They didn't have to think about rebuilding their culture. We had to fight to do that, to create a new African culture, where we drew on the fundamental principles that we carried from Africa here, and then reformulated them here and added new ones, new principles, one of which was race consciousness. So in the case of Louise Langdon Little, she didn't have a sense of race consciousness that was instilled in her based on the exposure to racism 24/7. She's coming from an island in which most of the people Black, almost all of them. So they don't have white people viewing them in a certain way and hanging them by the trees with ease. This was a period of lynching. You don't have night riders, the KKK, You've got your own legacy of slavery, and it was just as cruel as this one, But the island's being run because they're under a colonial system remotely. They got someone there from Britain or France, in this case, Britain and Grenada. But that overwhelming presence of whites is not there. And so she was somebody that wouldn't see a racial slight in everything that she faced with white people. And she would maneuver thinking that she was free, knowing that she's in a racist society, but it's not embedded in her the way it is with us. And so she would have a different way of handling racial slights. And she had an immigrant's optimism that her children could achieve full rights in this country, provided that they had the skills, that they could do better. This is partially what drives most immigrants that come to this country. And they will come in here with one objective: to take whatever they need to progress, and that's it. You hear me? Most of them will say we're going back home, but they get enticed by bright lights in big city. But some of them do return home. But they are between two worlds. The island world, if they come from the Caribbean or Africa or whatever part, South America, whatever part of the world they come from, and then here. And then their children become more the reality of here, with parents, descended from the islands or Africa or South America. But very much, if they're raised in New York. But they got that Caribbean thing going on. So this is part of what the marriage between Earl Little and Louise Langdon Little bring together. It's a Pan-African union, you could call it. So Earl Little had this uppity, rebellious behavior, and he believed he was entitled to human rights. And this blended with Louise Langdon Little's belief that her children could progress with a good education, and that they could overcome this racism that they faced. And she understood racism was real, but it wasn't and understanding is ingrained is when you live under it 24/7. Now, race pride was the common bond between Earl and Louise Little. It was the cornerstone of Louise Langdon Little's teachings to her children. Race pride. That was her heart and soul. That also is the heart and soul of Garveyism. Garvey would get race consciousness from us, but he was proud in his Blackness before ever coming here. But he began to think in a race conscious way through his awakening that came through his exposure to Blacks in this country. I've covered this before. So the oldest child, Wilford, made this point. He said, "My mother was always making us see the importance of not making the color distinction." What he meant was she was lighter complexion, and she made it clear. Light skin, dark skin, you're Black. And you be proud of that. And she made no distinctions around color. And she taught her children to believe in the pride of being Black. And with the exception of Malcolm, all of them were dark in complexion. And she was instilling in them the sense of being proud of that. And at the same time, in Malcolm, as he pointed out in the autobiography, in teaching him that, which because of the things that happened to this family is disrupted, and he has to come back to it later. So one of the things that Louise told Wilford and the other children was this, and this is something you hear from sisters a lot, especially light-skinned sisters who love being Black. I got a good friend who said this about her ambitions for her sons, that she wants the same thing to happen because she already did it with her husband. She told her children that, quote, and this is not the sole reason she married Earl Little. This ain't the sole reason. But what she said is that the reason I married your father was because he was dark. I wanted my children to have color. In other words, she loved Blackness. Now, she didn't just marry him because he was dark. He was a Garveyite. They shared some common views together. He wasn't no handkerchief head. She wouldn't be marrying no handkerchief head. You know what handkerchief head is? Somebody who's always grinning and skinning when they should be doing a different kind of skinning, you know, that doesn't involve grinning. So Wilford said of his mother, she always made us proud of our dark father. She would never let you say anything derogatory or bad about someone because he was Black. Never. While Malcolm would depart from these teachings for a part of his life, he never fully departed from them. See, the autobiography gives you the impression that he just went to the dead level, lost the ability to read and write, was on the streets and was just dead to the world of Blackness. He exaggerated to make a point. You know what I mean? His point was to show that he had gone from the mud out of it and to show his transformation, but he exaggerated because if you looked at Malcolm, he even in the autobiography said that he was proud of his brother because while Malcolm had him a white girlfriend on the streets, his brother only liked Black women. He liked that. Now, I mean, if you're completely wiped out to racial pride, that's a whole nother story. And by the way, the picture that he gives in the autobiography of his relationship to the white woman whose name has later been revealed, who was Armenian and so forth and so on, is according to C.O.R.E, the more recent stuff coming from C.O.R.E, he's no longer alive, his close friend on the streets. It wasn't a worshipful relationship. Malcolm wasn't around there worshiping whiteness. In fact, it was Far from it, you know. So even when it goes to what's his so-called assimilated street period, he ain't as assimilated as he said, but he was, but not as assimilated as he said. So Malcolm was born not long after the incident he relates to in the autobiography where the Klan comes and terrorizes the family. He's told about this. He's in his mother's womb. She's on the verge of having a child. And so it's Wilford, who's the oldest child, who's able to give the account of the mother's heroism. Because at this time, when the Klan comes, the father's out of town. And this is fortunate for them. Because while the father had a 38 and a shotgun, there was a whole bunch of armed Klansmen. They were out to get him, you know. And probably the only reason why the family survived is Louise Langdon Little stood there with that erect posture and made it clear they had no business being there. They hadn't done anything wrong. You know what I mean? In effect, she was telling them to leave them alone. And so this kind of confused these white boys and they ended up riding off. But the point is, she showed no fear. She stood up there for her family and her little children all holding her dress, and she's on the verge of having a child. But that was Louise Langdon Little. In addition to being proud of being Black, she was brave and she was politically conscious. So when her oldest son says that she was a heroic figure, this is one of the examples that drove that into his head. And she didn't raise her children to be compliant. My mother raised us the same way, but she wasn't all that political, my mother. My father was. But she never gave us the stories of if the cops come, do this and do that. She never gave that message, you know. But in the case of Louise Langdon Little, she was teaching, along with the example of their father, Earl Little, rebelliousness, but in a Caribbean way. She'd tell the kids when it came to racism in the schools, well, you know, don't react to it all the time. They're going to move past that. And she always taught them to be proud of themselves, and they didn't have a sense of being inferior. So this is what Wilford said about his mother's effect on how they related to whites, the philosophy they adopted from her. He said in particular, when whites find out that you don't have an inferiority complex, they deal with you on that level. If you acted like you were inferior, that's the way they related to you. If you didn't act like you were inferior, then they would be forced to treat you as an equal. And this is the way we were. Now, this is kind of the philosophy of as you think, so you are. Now, this really does govern life. You know, how you think is generally how things go. I've often said on this show, if you think there are no good Black men, you ain't going to find any. Because when they're right in front of you, you won't see them. As you think, so you are. So there's something to this. You know what I mean? In fact, it reminds me of George Washington Carver, because when he would face racism, sometimes he would laugh and then get the whites to laugh because his insight into white people, because he's not a warrior, he's a scientist, a little guy. He ain't out to be fighting nobody. His insight is that's a reflection of the sense of white inferiority, which is right. Any people who will downgrade another people and treat them as inferior have a deep sense of inferiority themselves. That's why when James Baldwin was dealing with this "in" thing, he pointed to white America and said, "You're the "in." You invented it." People who have no culture, people who have no history, well, the stuff you've constructed is false. Land of the free and home of the brave. Really? Huh? So This was a mentality they had. Now, let's deal with reality. The reality is Earl Little had that mentality. He had to leave the South because it could get him lynched. My father had it and whipped the owner of the plantation, I pointed this out before, in Orange, Texas, his sons behind, and was threatened with a lynching. But then the next day, the white boy, the owner of the plantation, who was called the master, it was like slavery, sharecropping, gives my father a job, calls him Mr. At 12 years of age, Mr. In the South, at that time, you're a boy when you're 100 in their eyes, you know? So this worked in some cases, but in others it didn't. But it was a good philosophy to have. And this came from Louise Langdon Little, with her bad, proud self, with her Grenadian sensibility translated into a violent situation. So when Malcolm was born, he was technically the seventh child. That book, The Seventh Child, technically. He was the fourth child in his second marriage with Louise Langdon Little, and he would be the seventh because there were three before him, including his sister Ella in the first marriage. So technically, he's the seventh child. So Earl, coming out of the South and coming out of the blues tradition, saw Malcolm as the good luck sign. 7 is good luck in African and in African American culture. Now, Malcolm said the reason why Earl would take him to places when he was going out to speak for the UNIA was because of his color. But he gave that same status to Ella, who was very dark complexion, because he saw her as his special child in his first marriage. It's equally possible that he took Malcolm out because he was his good luck child. It's equally as possible. And when it came to rendering a whipping, sometimes the mother did it. The serious stuff, the mother would give it to the father, to do. You really didn't want that big, bad black man hitting you. Wilfred said he was the strongest man he had ever met, other than a jar, probably. You know what I mean? Huh? But anytime the father got the assignment to whip Malcolm, he'd give it to the mother. He couldn't do it. I don't think that was color. I think that was spirituality, the seventh child, the good luck charm. So in African culture, 7 is the magical number. Among the Dogon, it's the symbol of perfection. I went into this some time ago, but people haven't heard it. I'll give it to you again. It represents the unity of masculine and feminine. It's a sign of perfection. It's a different definition of perfection. 4 is a number for the female. It's the feminine sexual parts. 3 is a number for the male, the masculine sexual parts. The union of 3 and 4, 7, which in Dogon thought is called the seventh numo, N-U-M-M-O or N-O-M-M-O, seventh word. What the Dogon are saying is perfection is the synthesis of masculine and feminine qualities. And so the creative, the union of the creative, of the masculine qualities, the union of the sensitive, intuitional, higher mind, nurturing feminine qualities, when either the male or female can blend those two together, accentuating more to the masculine for the male and more to the feminine to the female, that's perfection, which it isn't perfection by Western terms. It's not freedom of thought, it's balance. And that in Bambara culture, which Malcolm's great African ancestor came from would be called Ma. I've talked about this before. Self-mastered man or woman, Ma. And in Kemetic culture, it would be called Jeroma, self-mastered culture or person. So 7, you hear me? Now, in African American culture, in the blues tradition, which Earl grew up under, the 7th child was the magical child, born under the magical sign, born on the 7th hour of the 7th month of the 7th day, when 7 doctors say, born with good luck. And can't you see I got $700 and you better not mess with me. I'm the hoochie coochie man. You should know, some of you young ones should know what that means. You're the ladies' man, hoochie coochie. Malcolm tried to play that when he was on the streets, and then he got stripped after that. Betty said to him, after he got his act together in prison and came out and everything, Malcolm went through a period where he was a celibate, had no sex at all, because he was trying to go from one extreme to the other, correct that extreme that he had before and get it right. That was Malcolm. You know what I mean? That was the discipline that he could get. By the way, he inherited a lot of things from the mother, but discipline was something that he had, that he inherited somewhere else. You hear me? Huh? Now, 7 was a very important number in Malcolm's life. Because some of y'all, this is spooknology for you, the spiritual. It spooks you out. I know some of y'all like that. Some of you couldn't deal with that astrology that I was running down, right? Well, you have trouble dealing with this one too. Malcolm believed not only was he the 7th child, and that was magical, he believed that, but the most important temple he led in the Nation of Islam was temple number 7 in New York. He gave it that number, 7. And then he would have varieties of 7, 7, 1, or whatever. You know what I mean? 7 was an important number for Malcolm. When Malcolm attended the Sonny Liston fight, he was in row 7, seat 7. That was to him a sign of victory for Muhammad Ali. You understand? He was assassinated on February 21st, signifying 3 times 7, 21. 21's my number. Everyone has a number, a vibratory number. You are living in a despiritualized world where spirit's taken out of everything. Mathematics is at the core of the universe. And just as planets are energies, just as quantum physics is a study of energies, waves and particles, so mathematics itself is a spirit system. It's not only a quantity, it's an entity. For me, I joined the San Francisco Freedom Movement when I'm 21 years of age, 1960. Astrologically, I have 3 planets in 21. My Uranus in the 10th house, that's the place of the world. That's revolution, 21 degrees. My Mercury in the 1st house, that's a personality. That's what you show to the world, 21 degrees in Leo. And my Neptune, 21 degrees in Virgo in the 2nd house, which is the house of values and can also be money. So the 21st day of every month, something happens with me, and it's based on how prepared I am. But it's a sign of change. You hear me? Change. The 42nd year of my life, the same thing. Change. So this is spooknology for some of you. For Malcolm, this was real. And for a lot of Black people, it's real. Now, what was Malcolm like as a child? What did their family think of him? At 2 years of age, Malcolm was viewed by his family as a child with great physical and mental energy. And Wilford, again, makes this observation. He said he was always alert, always searching into things. He wasn't the physical one. When it came to a fight, the Littles had a reputation. You fight one, you're going to have to fight all of them except Malcolm. Malcolm didn't do the fighting. And when he got in the boxing ring 2 times, he got beat both times. The second time, he got beat by this white boy. So he said he's going to train a little harder. And the second time he beat him, he got knocked out in the first round, almost in the first tap. Boom. Filbert, who was a younger brother that was his troubling little brother, they got into mischief together, was embarrassed. Filbert was a good boxer. And he went out, he said, this is a shame. But that wasn't Malcolm. But that didn't mean he didn't have any courage. It was more the mind with Malcolm. He had the imposing body and stuff, but he wasn't the one out to, throw dukes. That wasn't Malcolm. Now, in the case of, again, Louise Langdon Little, she is a major force for uplifting the minds of her children, of instilling knowledge, comes through her. And Filbert, Malcolm's running buddy, his younger brother, they would do mischief together, and I'm understating that one. I'm not going into that here. He made this comment about his father. He said, quote, I can't say that I've any evidence that my father believed in education. Now, this is unusual because for Black people, I don't care what little or amount of education you have, that's a cardinal thing with most Black people. But for Earl Little, education wasn't the thing that he believed in part because in Georgia, he didn't get a chance to get much of an education, 3 years. And having the skill of a master builder, he could take care of his family. He could put a roof over their head and land that they could grow food on. Now, you'd always have to struggle on that because he'd have to go out and, go around in a neighborhood and get whatever jobs he could because often the union jobs were not available or whatever jobs he had, he'd get fired, because either whites would come in who were working and saying, fire him or something's going to happen or whatever. So it was never like he was making a huge amount of money, but he may well have felt that that's what he had that would take care of a family. But that's unusual because my father, for example, it turns out had no education, wanted to be a lawyer and taught himself how to read and, wanted me to be a lawyer to fulfill his ambition. And that's true with most Black people. But the point is, it was Louise Langdon Little who was the believer in education. And she's the one that passed knowledge and skills to her children. And Malcolm, of all of them, was the biggest beneficiary of her lessons because he inclined in the direction that she went mentally, more than the other children. So with her excellent education, her children were taught foundational skills. My mother was a straight A student. She did that. A lot of your parents probably did that. I got a better education that prepared me for elementary school than all of my teachers. My mother had been a straight A student, good in math, good in everything, smart. Ran her own preschool, academic preschool. So we went to school, we were ready for 3rd grade. All this C.O.R.E, C-spot, and all this other stuff was just a joke to us. You know what I mean? Give us something serious to read. We were reading it at home. You know what I mean? So she prepared them for this. But then after school, she had her own teachings. And so after school, when the kids came home, this is how she taught. She had a West Indian newspaper, that is a Grenadian newspaper, published by a man named Theophilus Albert Show. He was a leader of Grenada's independence movement. She had that newspaper spread out on the table, and she had Garvey's Negro World. Now, Louise Langdon Little wrote regularly for the UNIA newspaper. When Garvey was on the run from J. Edgar Hoover, who was then in charge of the Internal Bureau of Investigation, later the FBI, he had set Garvey up to be tried on a false charge of using the mails to defraud. Garvey was hiding out. One of the places he hid out after the death of Malcolm's father was the Little family. And guess who was his security? Louise Langdon Little's cousin. This was a no-joke sister. You hear me? So you would expect that a mother's going to be teaching her child. She's going to have some little book there to read. You know what I mean? Something geared to that level of the children. No, she's got independent journals. One calling for the independence of Grenada, the other calling for the independence of Africa. And she's reading from those newspapers. So what she's doing is she's instilling in her children a sense of global African consciousness, a sense that Black people should be independent and free from colonialism. And she was teaching them how Black people fit into global African history and global politics. Now, this is some radical teaching here. And when a child would ask a question about what a word meant, what do you think she said? Go to the dictionary. So what effect did this have on Malcolm? I pointed out before, in 1963, I was a part of a leadership group that met with Malcolm, 14 of us, in the Sun Reporter newspaper building. A huge number of leaders had been invited. Only about 14 of us showed up, my father with me. And Malcolm was sitting, I pointed this out before, with his back to the wall, with a number of newspapers on the table. And he began to pontificate on the movement and where the movement was going. I went into my responses and stuff. Now, the point is, Malcolm was teaching from newspapers the same way his mother was. You hear me? On the national movement, the Black freedom movement, on the international movement in Africa. And the newspaper he had spread out at that time was the New York Times. When Malcolm was in prison, he claimed that he was basically illiterate and had to go back and read the whole dictionary, which he wasn't. You know, he couldn't have been one of the best students in his class and everything else, and this lost his literacy. But it was probably had eroded a little bit, and he needed to get it tighter. But what did he do? He went to what his mother would send him to, the dictionary. In this case, took it to the extreme because he had some discipline, and read every word in the dictionary. But again, dictionary, mama. Method of teaching, mother. You hear me? Now, this is a side thing that's very important to understand. In the Autobiography of Malcolm X, Malcolm relates that his father was murdered by the right wing, the Klan, a Klan affiliate, because of his militant leadership in the Garvey movement, probably. Now, this book, The Dead Are Arising, the author, Les Payne, interviewed the oldest son, Wilford, on what actually happened. And this is a common view of everyone in the family, except for Malcolm. And it was the common view of the mother, Louise Langdon Little, until she began to believe in rumors. What actually happened, and Wilbert was there, not when the father died, but when the police came to the house and reported on what happened. And then he got to view the body when it was brought in to the house. And he made the comment that he watched the cop who came. It was a young white guy. He was a nice guy. He was relating what actually happened. That what actually happened was the father, Earl Little, had gone into town against his wife's advice, this is in the autobiography, she was psychic and she told him, don't, don't go into town. Something's going to happen. Something's going to happen. And he didn't listen and went into town. He's going to get on a streetcar, and he goes into his pocket and he realizes he left his coat somewhere. So he goes back to get the coat. And he said that he would catch the next train. Well, these trains went around the circle and would come back. And so he's running to catch the next train. What happens is he slips and he falls. And what happens is he gets pulled, his leg gets pulled under this train and cut off, severed. And he tells a woman who comes to help him out, contact my wife, get her here, because he knows he's not going to live very long. So when the wife goes to the hospital, he's dead. And she sees that his leg is severed. When the body's brought back to the house, Wilford sees the same thing. And so this death, while, it would be a reasonable assumption that they could do that. In fact, in this particular case, that didn't happen. And Wilford was the eyewitness. He inspected the body when he came in and everything else, and it fit the description of what they said actually happened. But that's a side point. But the side point is that there are some things in the autobiography that, in this case, Malcolm didn't lie. He believed it. And his mother didn't believe this until she started to hear some rumors and then began to believe it when she's under a lot of other pressure. So this is a side point. But the key point is, when Malcolm's father died, the family is sustained, continues to be sustained, even though weakened, through the teachings of race pride of the mother and the father that persist, coming out of the Garvey movement and coming out of their own beliefs. So even though the family was weakened and eventually would, the mother would be forced into a mental institution for what was a nervous breakdown, and Wilford had taken his mother to a psychiatrist prior to this, and the doctor said there's nothing wrong with her. She's just overwhelmed. She's tired. She needs rest. Is there any place she can go to rest? Well, she had 8 children. She only had a welfare check, and she decided to take that because this is in the midst of the Depression. The father would have never accepted that as a Garveyite. He believed in self-reliance. And she was denied a $10,000 insurance policy that she was entitled to. The police report said death by accident. But because, and he was paid up on his insurance policy, but because this is a Black woman, they decided to hell with you and mark the death as suicide and then tell her, prove it, that it was death by accident. Actually, there's a coroner's report that proves it, but they're not going to pay. And so the mother is put under this constant pressure. And gradually she withdraws inside herself and then gets committed. When in fact, all she needed was rest, even at that time. A nervous breakdown doesn't require committal to a nut house. You know what I mean? It requires some rest. But she had no place to go for rest. She was doing good to have food to feed her children. And by this time, the eldest son is filling in, raising the children, getting a second job, and whatnot. So she spends 23 years in a mental institution. And most of that time, she was back to normal. because she did get to rest in the mental institution. So imagine 23 years. But you'll see in a minute, there's some lessons she imparted from that experience to Malcolm that would help him in prison. Again, you understand Malcolm, you understand family, you understand the central role of Louise Langdon Little on the family and especially on Malcolm. One of the gifts that she left the family, but especially Malcolm, were the spiritual gifts. She didn't like being called a psychic. People would call her a psychic. She didn't like that term. But she taught certain lessons to her children. The most important lessons were to value spiritual revelations, to value any kind of psychic sense of a warning of danger, and to appreciate and respect the ability to see beings that are not physical. And by the way, Malcolm had some of those visions in prison. He had some visions of being visited physically by a spirit. But the point is, this was a gift that she had that she passed on to her children. In Malcolm's case, he made the point that he could always sense something before it happened. He said, I have never known something truly significant to happen that caught me completely off guard, except one thing. That was Elijah Muhammad. And he had shut his mind to things he had heard about him for years. So that was partially his fault. That was partially his fault. He wasn't listening to people who was telling him stuff because he didn't want to believe it. But the point is, in the shows we've covered on God Within, we all have gifts. We all have spirit powers. And our basic gift, our Ka, that's our destiny. And that's also the unique gifts that we were all endowed with. And to be in tune with that, to draw from that, that's the most rewarding thing we have. When you say you're purely alone, that's never true. God is within all of us. And the spirit is what drives us. And when you listen to what that inner voice is telling you and telling you to follow, you don't usually do wrong. I know my mistakes come when I don't follow that. And it's usually on minor things, because I've usually followed it on the major things. But sometimes, like something tells me to stay in this lane, don't go in that. I'm an intuitive driver. So I'm always anticipating what a driver's doing. I'm not just believing it says left turn, they're turning left, But when I don't listen, that's when I got a problem. I told you, some of you earlier on, when the earthquake occurred in 1987, I was in PhD program. And I didn't have to be at this program for something like 5 hours later, but the spirit said, leave right now. It wasn't a voice, it was a feeling. And I said, I'll be sitting there for 3 to 4 hours. And then I said, it never tells me wrong. And so I left about 3 hours early. Had I left at the time that I should have to get to the appointment, the Bay Bridge opened at that time. The Dunbarton Bridge collapsed. I would have been on one of those too. Went through both of them, And then people told me, well, Spirit didn't tell me anything. I said, yeah, because you ain't been listening for so long that, you don't hear it anymore. Birds know when something's going to happen. They got the feeling of an earthquake's going to happen. They know. Watch animals in nature. They got the sense, because everything God created that's matter is also spirit. So this was a great legacy that Louise Langdon Little left her family, and especially Malcolm X. Just one final lesson that Malcolm learned from his mother was delivered to him in a proverbial way, because Africans in the Caribbean teach a lot through proverbs. And that teaching system comes from Africa. And Malcolm's mother had been confined in a mental institution for over 23 years. And so she learned something about how to handle that time, you know? And so she delivers a message to Malcolm when he's in prison. And that message was very simple. Listen to this. Real wisdom. Quote, make time serve you. Don't serve the time. Make time serve you. Don't serve the time. You hear me? In other words, take this time and use it to grow. Take this time and use it to get wise, to empower yourself. Because she had always seen a weakness in Malcolm. She had told the other children, that light complexion. She saw that could affect Malcolm. It may not have affected him then, but she had that intuitive sense. She understood that. Malcolm took that message serious, so much so that he would say later that his greatest feeling of freedom came in confinement, because it is there that he experienced what his brother Wilfred had already experienced, and most of the other members of his family had experienced, the freedom of the mind that the mother and father had been teaching them all the time, but especially the mother. And so he took maximum advantage of it. His education in prison was better than any university education. We underwent that same experiences, and he went through the sixfold stages to mental freedom. Same stages. That's an organic process. And so that led to his growth, his transformation. He was always an honest person. Even when he was into shifty stuff, he would never lie about it. You know, that was a good quality, you know. And so as he polished things, as he got a base of knowledge, as he internalized it, he underwent what he called before first his philosophy changed, his attitude changed, his thought pattern changed, his communication pattern changed, his behavior pattern changed. He was describing the transformational process because he took his mother's advice and made sure that he made time serve him. He didn't serve time, you know. He was in that prison cell reading books most of the time or engaging in debates and practicing with Harvard students, the refinement of his skills. So to know Malcolm is to know his family, especially the beautiful, wise, brave, loving, globally conscious, proud African Caribbean woman, Louise Langdon Little, a queen among queens and a master teacher, not just to her children, but to all of us. Louise Langdon had been told when she was in Grenada, she would face 5 tragedies in life. Again, some of us, we don't get into the spiritual stuff. Some of us do, but some of us don't. I'm talking to the ones who are just purely into the intellectual and the reasoning and the scientific approach. And I'm not against science, though I think spirit science is a science that'll save you, because nature isn't objectified as just matter, but spirit and matter, so you can learn from it. But she had been told that she would face 5 tragedies in life. And this proved to be true. What were they? The death of her husband. tragic death. It was devastating for the whole family. The burning down of her house that threatened the lives of her children. Her commitment to a mental institution when it shouldn't have happened. The imprisonment of her son and his assassination. But she would live to 91 years of age. 91 years of age. And so she could see the tragedy, but she could also see the greatness of her children. Because it wasn't just Malcolm. It was that little family that built up the Nation of Islam before Malcolm. And in fact, it was his oldest brother, Wilfred, who engineered his awakening and was minister in the temple in Detroit and was the first real builder, along with his family members, of the Nation of Islam. This is often not noted. Malcolm would then come under Wilfred's influence and the training of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, and using his own natural gifts as an organizer. He was born with these gifts as a speaker, as an organizer. He always liked people in their place. That was a part of that organizing thing. He had the same approach to organizing that Barack Obama had. You know, it's a gift, you know. Very good organizer, master organizer. One of the two best we produced in the 60s. And he had a natural sense of rebellion that came from a jar, that came from his father, that came from his mother, but it was basic to his personality. And like his mother, who had an intuitive gift, Malcolm had a prophetic gift. He was good at prophesizing. I'm not. Most of us don't have that gift. He predicted the urban rebellions before they happened. He predicted the rise of Pan-Africanism in the Black liberation movement. He predicted how the youth would move, at least in his generation. So these were gifts. These were his, particularly he was born with, but they were cultivated by his mother. In some extent, the Nation of Islam helped him. At a certain point, they were a straitjacket that he needed to distance himself from. But the key point is Malcolm was a family man. His mother and father were his main teachers, with Louise Langdon Little, his primary one. And as he grew also in the respect of Black women. By the end of his life, he was saying, you measure the state of a people by the level of its women. When the women are high up, highly educated, knowledgeable, and powerful, the people would be. He's referring to African people, because this is not the way Western culture works. They degrade their women and get away with it. They ruled the world, stepping on their women and stepping on everybody else and stepping on the masses of their people. But African people, those that try that, they'll be in a mess, because that's going against their culture. Their culture requires balance and justice. That's seventh son or daughter. Perfection is the synthesis of masculine and feminine, the balance of males and females. That's the theme I deal with in my book, Return to the African Mother Principle of Male and Female Equality. So I want to encourage people to subscribe to this show. Hit the subscribers button. I want to thank Brother Ogawa, and I also want to thank Lao Tzu for their help, and Brother who has just piped into this show at 11:53, named Dan Freeman. It's actually Lawrence Freelo, who was the third person who's going to make up our team, who's the high-tech technician. One of my former students, the main inspiration for me writing the book, The Integration Trap, Generation Gap, caused by a choice between two cultures. So we're putting together some people who got some skills I don't have. You understand? To take this show to another place. And while it's been hard to get our subscription numbers up, they have been going up. And I want to say to Brother Ugawa, thanks to your work, because when I look at the number who are subscribing from the show, more of the subscriptions that are coming in now are coming from the way you're working the platforms, Instagram and others. So I'm saying to you, encourage your friends to subscribe. Every show demonstrates why the sixfold stages to mental freedom is important. And I don't care how conscious you are. I don't care how conscious I think I am. We all are undergoing transformation. And the point that we are continuing to work on ourselves, we will retard, you know? So it's good for all of us. So I want to say, I hope you got something out of this. And this took a lot of time preparing for this show. I don't know if you all get this. You know what I mean? I do my best with each show. I'm trying to leave people a trail that they can use, something that's beautiful and truthful. I could do this off the top of my head, and some of it is, but I got to give you solid stuff because you deserve the best. So, Hotep, peace be to you. And let's see if we got any questions. Lao Tzu. Dr. T'Shaka, question. Can we reframe this COVID-19 pandemic as a prison sentence and make this time serve us versus serving the time? Yeah. Provided that we use our common sense that ain't so common anymore and do our homework. Because if we operate on the assumption that some of us have operated on, that this ain't serious, probably 2 million people have died in this country. They say 800,000. They don't have a counting system. They don't want to know. A lot of people have died, and unnecessarily so. And right now, most of the deaths are coming from people who don't have a shot. So what I'd say is learn something about this COVID-19. Study it. Do your homework. Check out the countries in which people are doing well with this, which is mainly the Asian and Caribbean countries. And Africa is doing better than they should, given that they don't have any vaccines or anything, because the world, the Western world, isn't giving it up, you know? So part of the lesson is, yeah, use this time to take care of your health first. And a lot of the vulnerable people, and some of us are among the most vulnerable, already have indicators that can trigger problems with this. So take care of your health, not just because of COVID. But I think what he also means is you've got extra time. You've had extra time where you've been confined more to a house or whatever. Use that time. But I would always say you should always be using all your time. Of course, one of our wise viewers made this comment, you know, work hard, do all your work, dream child. He's one of the real conscious brothers. I listed some of his reading material a couple of weeks ago. He just had a birthday. Him and his wife both had birthdays recently. Happy birthday to both of them. And he made the point that, yeah, we should work hard, do what we're supposed to do, you know, make that time work for us. But he also said, but we should also rest and relax. In other words, don't overwork. And that's key too. And have balance in your life. That's key too. Enjoy yourself. That's key too. Tutim Ra Keperu. My book will be out soon. I want you to read it. You will enjoy it. It's titled Tutim Ra, The Prophecy of Reincarnation, Star Codes of Immortality. Right on. Check the book out, people. I'll check it out. This is another question up here. Did Louise Langdon Little maintain contact with her family in Grenada, and did they have any influence on the children? I don't know of any. Her main contact would have been her grandmother, and her grandmother died before she left the island. She was sent to live with an aunt that she didn't get along with, and then an uncle encouraged her to come to Canada. So I don't think so. But she, um, you know, she lived on Grenadian culture, African Caribbean culture, and then on the culture of African Americans as a member of the Garvey movement and married to a strong African freedom fighter, Earl Little. So she passed on the culture. I mean, the very fact that she's teaching from the newspaper of the foremost independence leader of Grenada at that time, Mary Show, is an indication of that. She's teaching the culture of resistance, you know. So, question. Um, Dr. T'Shaka, the positive self-image of Louise Langdon Little possessed and passed on to her children, is this sometimes viewed as arrogance by Africans born in the USA, hindering unity? Um, I think some people will make the mistake of thinking that self-love is arrogance. That's ridiculous. Arrogance is when you don't listen. Arrogance is when, you think you're better than other people. No, pride is natural for the human being. All of God's creatures exude pride. And I'm talking about the four-legged ones. You ever see a duck? See the pride of a duck? You know what I mean? A cat, a dog, they don't have to be taught no pride. They carry themselves that way. And so this pride that she manifested is no different from the pride that Black people have in this country. What she benefited from was living in an island where she didn't have lynching and all of this racism on her 24/7. And so then that enabled her to have a greater sense of freedom. Not all people in the Caribbean have pride because it depends on how that slave experience affected you, you know? And so you got colorism in the Caribbean like you do here, you know? And you've got slave mentalities, colonial mentalities, and you've got that in Africa. So it depends on the level of consciousness of the person. But for her, that was clearly based on love of self, love of her children, love of her people, love of humanity. And she exuded that. Bruce Watkins, blessing, Brother T'Shaka. The power of the mind from there puts ideas into action, create ownership. Yeah. If your mind is free, your body's going to be free. See, here's a key thing. We're under oppression, right? Yes. But if you freed the mind, you freed the behind. And you don't have this sense of being under constant pressure because when you're in the zone of freedom, mental freedom, spiritual freedom, then it promotes all other kinds. And then you're also free from things like fear, which is an illusion. You're taught that. It's drilled into you. You weren't born that way. It's the greatest, I pointed this out many times before, it's the greatest hindrance to spiritual growth and development. Fear. It locks you up. You get irrational. It's not real. LaShonda C. Henderson, absolutely. Entering the city changes people. It does become a double-mindedness. Okay. She probably means double consciousness. Yeah, urbanization can obviously be a problem. You got all kinds of values that are hitting you, one of which is material, another one is individualism. And so Blacks who migrated from rural into urban areas have experienced changes in terms of values. But this generation, the post 1968 generations that have been hit by the powerful forces that have hit our community, like drugs, deindustrialization, and a host of other things, the prison industrial system, that's put people under special pressure and led to what God told me is a choice between two cultures, where we're often unconsciously making choices either consistent or inconsistent with our culture. Suicide being one that some are making that to a degree that we haven't before, even though our rates are lower than anyone else's. They're getting higher. The Chi, The Dead Are Arising is a great book, and it showed that Malcolm was very conscious about the NOI and would have been great without the NOI. He became very conscious towards the end of his time in the Nation of Islam. And the point of he would have been great without the NOI, yeah, would have, should have, but in real life, it's what happens. And this was a part of his destiny pattern. So there's the positives and negatives of the nation. The positives are that he gave him an organization that helped him in his awakening process and gave him a field for realizing and utilizing his innate skills as an organizer, as a speaker, as a thinker. But it also became a straitjacket after a period of time. And he would have been better without it after a period of time. Yes, in the ideal world, maybe without it at all, but this ain't the ideal world. One of the unfortunate things is that Malcolm's very successes in building the Nation of Islam created the problems, taking a broke organization to an organization worth 75 million or more brought out the conservative tendencies within the leadership. There was some corrupt tendencies there all along. And in the end, he was viewed as a threat because he wasn't somebody who was going to place the material things above his people. And that was a great quality of Malcolm's and King, any of us in the movement who have really served our people. So yeah, those were real problems, and that it took him so long to see it is unfortunate. And because he was a family-oriented person, even when he was forced out of the nation, he wanted back in. How long he would have stayed is another question. The Chi. I'm so glad someone's speaking on others who influenced Malcolm, because too many believe Malcolm was nothing until the NOI. Yeah, very true. And that's not to deny the NOI's influence. Okay. Let's see if there's anything on the bottom. Okay. And Robin, want to thank you for being one of the dedicated listeners and being supportive of this show. And King Pianki, all of you, I appreciate you. And this is one of the things I enjoy doing some hard work, but I like hard work. So I hope you got something out of this. Um, we talked about a beautiful sister, Louise Langdon Little. Also, isn't it funny? 6'4" people whose last name is Little. Ain't that funny? It's kind of like black people who are as black as midnight, Mr. White. Of course, the whites don't think it's funny when they call themselves Blackstone and all the rest of this stuff. I do think it's funny when they're called Savage. They got names like that. I won't say what I think of that, but I mean, I think that's funny. So I've enjoyed it. Hotep, until next week.